Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third conversation in the Summer Speaker Series brought to you by the AEI Academic Programs Department. The Summer Speaker Series is a chance for members of our student network to stay connected with each other and take a deeper dive into some of the latest scholarship coming out of AEI during the summer months. My name is Emma Costa. I'm an academic programs assistant here at AEI, and today I'm really excited to be speaking with Kori Schake on To Lead or Not to Lead, Examining America's Global Role. So before getting started, I just want to remind you all that we'll be hosting these conversations on Wednesdays, usually at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, throughout both June and July. So just keep an eye out on your inbox for future invitations, and be sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students to check out our full June lineup and very soon our full July lineup as well. The last thing I'll mention before we get started is that if you attend 3 or more of our Summer Speaker Series webinars, you'll be automatically entered into a t-shirt giveaway. We'll be posting that design on Instagram very soon, but just stay tuned throughout the summer for your chance to win. Our format today is pretty straightforward. Dr. Schake and I will have a conversation for around 20 minutes or so, and then I'll turn to your questions. So if you do have questions for Dr. Schake throughout the webinar, please type in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get as many of them as possible in during the last 10 minutes of our session. With all of that being said, I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Kori Schake, the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies here at AEI. Dr. Schake, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
It's a great pleasure.
So just to get started, obviously this talk is about America's role in the world, so it's of course also about foreign policy. However, recent domestic events such as the coronavirus pandemic and the killing of George Floyd have threatened to undermine American credibility abroad. Can you talk a little bit about why our internal affairs matter in our foreign relations?
Oh, absolutely. I love that question. America's internal affairs matter in 2 important ways. The first is that it's our values, our domestic political compact, our belief that people have rights and they loan them in limited ways to governments for consensual purposes. That's our fundamental domestic political compact. And that's what takes America out in the world. That's why we care about the Chinese government putting 1 million Uyghur in concentration camps. That's why we care about the ability of Russians to be able to protest against their government. That's why we care about the terrible carnage in Syria. Because we believe people have God-given rights and should have the liberty to exercise them as they see fit with their own conscience. So Americans get pulled out into the world because we're shocked when things happen that are affronts to our values. That's why the United States is different than any other dominant power that has controlled the international order. You know, the way to understand how a dominant power is going to behave internationally is to look at the way they behave domestically. And so Britain, as a great power, before it was a democracy, was quite repressive, and the fiat of the head of state mattered. The United States believed that you could build an international order on the basis of our values, and that others would help hold us to them as we helped hold others to them. The second reason that America's domestic troubles and tribulations, as well as our strengths, matter is that our values are genuinely universal. So when people see abuse by police of Black Americans, they're shocked as we are shocked. So you've seen the protests all over the world in free countries like Australia or Britain or Germany, people protesting not only police violence against citizens in the United States, but also that police nowhere should be able to repress their own citizens. So we're a model for what everyone wants for themselves. And it's impossible to imagine things we have seen in the United States occurring in Russia or China. First of all, the government wouldn't have let the protests occur in Russia. And second, the Chinese would never have let the military establishment take the side of the protesters, right? National Guardsmen kneeling in support of the racial justice claims of the protesters, chiefs of police marching with protesters, demanding that we all be equal under the law. So we are totemic for everyone in the international order about both what's possible and where change needs to occur.
Just as a potential follow-up for that, I think we've seen a lot of the Republican Party turn towards this more inward-facing America First foreign policy due to a lot of concerns that America was potentially wasting money and being taken advantage of by our allies. Now that American politics has taken this sharp turn towards the issues of criminal justice and healthcare, do you think that we could see a similar bent towards a domestic policy first trajectory in the Democratic Party?
That's a really interesting question, Emma. I do think that the definition of national security is going to be broadened as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the challenges of creating equal justice before the law in the United States. But I would say two things about that. The first is that, the pandemic also revealed the shortcomings of an America First foreign policy. That is that what our engagement with other countries and our involvement in international institutions gives us is strategic depth. We don't have to start dealing with a problem when it hits our territory. We have the ability to see it in other places, to help manage it in other places before it has consequences for Americans. And I think we saw with the pandemic, with the United States retreating from leadership of institutions like the World Health Organization, of not funding the Centers for Disease Control to have billets in the Chinese healthcare system. So they got to know doctors and got to be able to tell whether the Chinese government was telling us the truth with their statistics. That strategic depth, we could have seen much earlier what we were going to have to deal with. That's what an internationally engaged United States buys for the American public. And it's true that American allies aren't nearly as much help as we want them to be. But I think that's actually not quite the right question. The right question is, has a dominant power in the international order ever in history had this much voluntary assistance from other countries? And the answer is no. And the reason we get more help than any other dominant power has gotten is because of the values that guide us, and because we built an international order where the rules are consensual, where the Netherlands and Japan can help shape the rules so they volunteer to help fund the rules and enforce the rules. Nobody else has had the luxury the United States has had because we designed the system well.
Just looking sort of at the liberal world order and America's place in it, I think a lot of times it's very easy to criticize American involvement abroad because of the unintended consequences that are often very apparent and tangible. However, I think we often forget that not being involved also has its own set of consequences. So what do you think the world would look like if America became significantly less engaged and more isolationist?
Oh, I love that question. So first of all, I love the way you paraphrase the great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, which is that taking action has a moral cost, but not taking action also has a moral cost. They also have practical foreign policy costs. I think the last two American presidents, so both President Trump and President Obama, and even probably the last 2 years of President Bush's second term, you saw the United States receding from taking on new obligations, from getting involved. So the government of Israel tried to persuade the United States to join it in an attack on Iran's nuclear weapons programs. And President Bush didn't think he could carry the American public after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think President Obama campaigned and was elected for reducing America's involvement, not just in those wars, but its leadership in other places, right? So the NATO allies had us supporting them in their actions to protect the people of Libya. The US wasn't in the lead on that. And President Trump has taken that even further. He clearly wants to write off the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He has already badly damaged the anti-ISIS fight by pulling US troops out of Syria. And lots of other choices that make the circle of American influence smaller. And President Trump does it in a way that manages to maximize the costs and minimize the benefits of doing it by not consulting allies, by not helping allies be successful with or without us. So we are already seeing an America that for 13 or 14 years has been receding from leadership roles. And you can already see the consequences, right? A more tumultuous, less safe international order where terrible actors like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, like Xi Jinping in China, like Vladimir Putin in Russia, like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, are taking advantage of a window of opportunity to do terrible things to their own people, to make choices that make us less safe because they know we're not going to do anything.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of different presidential administrations and their approaches towards foreign policy, and we have a presidential election coming up very soon, and the winner will certainly influence future foreign policy decisions. You recently wrote an article detailing foreign policy missteps that Vice President Biden has made throughout his political career. I'm curious to hear, what degree do you think those decisions were unique to him? And to what degree do you think that they were influenced by trends within the Democratic Party at the time? And, do you think that anything has fundamentally changed since he's made those decisions?
It's a great challenge, Anna. What I tried to show in the Atlantic article is that Vice President Biden doesn't have very good judgment on foreign policy. As Iraqis were voting for cross-sectarian parties, so political leaders who would make compromises between Shiites and Sunni and Kurds, Vice President Biden was in favor of breaking the country up into three pieces and allowing them to become ethnically and sectarianly pure. That's not been a great answer to any foreign policy question ever, and certainly not now. So the first point I would make is that Vice President Biden doesn't have very good judgment, and he certainly doesn't have very good judgment about the use of military force. The second point I would make is that I agree with you. He's reflective of broader trends in the Democratic Party, right? He's opposed to trade deals that Republicans negotiate with South Korea or Colombia, but he's in favor of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which a Democrat negotiated. If you look at his voting record on trade, it's very highly correlated to partisanship. And so he's reflecting rather than leading the Democratic Party to a better place on the wars, on trade policy, on nuclear strategy. The third thing I would say, though, and I say this with deep and abiding regret, I think Joe Biden would be a better foreign policy president than Donald Trump has been, because the mistakes the president has made of not believing that like-minded states have a particular resonance with each other and that advancing our values internationally makes us safer and makes the rest of the world safer. President Trump clearly also doesn't agree with trade, believe that trade makes us all more prosperous. And he's even worse than Vice President Biden because President Trump pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. Vice President Biden would at least rejoin it. And there's a sort of willful destructiveness on President Trump's part that is doing genuine damage to America's relationships with NATO allies, with Japan, with Australia, with Mexico and Canada. And so there's going to be a lot of easy victories to pick up. And I worry actually that it's going to give Democrats a mantle of being responsible on foreign and defense policy that the Republican Party has worn very comfortably and very deservedly for a few decades now.
Great. So I think that we're probably going to only have time to fit in one more question. I could talk about this all evening. But just a reminder for everyone to please make sure that you submit your questions for Dr. Schake in the Q&A section below on Zoom. But, you know, obviously many young people are starting to form their political identities during this very uncertain period of our nation's history. You know, we're really grappling with tough questions over the pandemic and racial injustice and this rise of revisionist powers that could potentially alter the liberal world order that we've known. So what lessons do you hope that young people will take away from these very formative years?
Oh, that's a big blue sky fabulous question. So I guess the first thing I would say is that, you know, in the American military, there's a saying for leaders that anything you walk by without correcting becomes the new standard. And that's true in international politics too, right? The fact that we were weary of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and didn't help the people of Syria against a brutal government will make it easier for other brutal dictators to have us avert our eyes. So the first thing is what you tolerate becomes the new standard. And we should worry a lot about that, whether it's Syria or whether it's allowing the Chinese to cheat American businesses. And on that, President Trump has been much better than his predecessors. The second piece of advice I would give is that you shouldn't lose faith in the universal nature of the American political compact. Right? The truths that we hold to as self-evident are also what moms of 4 children in rural Pakistan and the mayor of a southern city in Mexico also want. We have lost confidence in our own values, and the people who are suffering and not in the luxurious position that we and most of our allied countries are, those people still believe it, and they deserve our help to get it. The third thing I would say is that the United States isn't good at having it right. We're good at getting it right. There was never a golden age where American politicians were statesmen and didn't have grubby domestic politics on their mind all the time. Right? Don't believe that that was ever us. It never was. But that doesn't mean that there isn't good we can do in the world. And the center of gravity will always be the political values, the sense of justice and equality and opportunity that drive American life also are what drive other people's lives.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It looks like we have some questions coming in now, so I'll move to that. The first one is from John Sabella, and he asks, with the U.S. experiencing recent events like COVID-19 and protest movements, will the global liberal order built by the U.S. after World War II persist, or will it be replaced by a more unstable multipolar world?
Oh, that's such a great question, John. And it's one I spend a lot of time on in my work. I think very often we underestimate how strong the structural advantages the United States has in the international order. First and foremost is the strength of the American economy. You know, we just splashed out $2 trillion, which is what, 10% of our total GDP. It's all in debt, and it didn't raise interest rates at all. You know, the French president Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 1970s resentfully described the strength of the United States dollar as an exorbitant luxury. And he's right, it is. We have the ability to exclude people from the dollar zone as a sanction against dangerous behavior. Nobody else can do that. The Federal Reserve just basically agreed to become the central banker to the entire world to provide enough liquidity to prevent economic constriction that throws economies off balance for everyone. No other country has a wingspan like that. No other country would even attempt it, in part because the United States is a bad historian. We always think things can change for the better. And so we attempt to change them for the better. And that too is an enormous part of American power in the international order. Who but us would believe the Balkans could be peaceful and multi-ethnic? Who but us would believe Germany and Japan could become free societies instead of a danger to the world? And we actually make those things happen. So I think the stickiness of American dominance in the order is much stronger than we often give it credit for. And I guess the last thing I'd say on John's good question is that it takes others willing and capable to do that. You know, hegemons are very often not the strongest or the richest power in the international order. They're the ones willing to do it, willing to set and enforce rules. So Switzerland's richer than us. Nobody cares what Switzerland thinks about anything. But the United States, for our own interests, is willing to set and enforce rules of the order that are beneficial for us and beneficial to others. And the credit we get for that, the trust we get for that, carries over into economics. It carries over into all sorts of other things that matter to us.
Awesome. Our next question is from Ian Burke, and he asks, what practical steps can future foreign policymakers take to rebuild the United States' credibility in the coming decades?
That's a great question, Ian. So the besetting sin of American foreign policy is how very often there's a huge gap between what we claim we are doing and what we are actually doing, right? So the last 4 or maybe even 5 American presidents have claimed they will not tolerate a nuclear weapon in Iran or in North Korea. At last time I checked, North Korea has 32 nuclear weapons. So that's clearly not true, and we're clearly not going to destroy those weapons, because a smarter policy is to try and diminish the political value of the weapons once they're in possession of a government as bad as North Korea or Iran. So the first thing to restoring credibility is to actually do what you say you're going to do. So Obama's red line in Syria that he walked away from, the red lines on Iran that we walked away from. You know, Napoleon has a great comment about credibility, and he said it to his generals during the Napoleonic Wars, the ones named for him. Napoleon said, if you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. And so you restore credibility by only making credible threats. A second thing that would be helpful to restoring American credibility is being nice to the people who actually like us, because they are valuable amplifiers of our own message. And when you don't tell the government of Germany that you're going to very quickly withdraw half the US troops stationed there, first of all, it affects Germany's security. Second of all, it affects Germany's economy and its communities where these people live. And so surprising your allies with bad news doesn't make them want to sing your praises or help you when you need help. So that would be the second thing I would do. The sad, honestly sad part about it, Ian, is that it's remarkably easy. The United States gets a lot of credit very cheaply for our credibility in the international order, and we should be deeply grateful about that.
Awesome, thank you. So we have one final question. We might have time for one more, but I think we might have time for two. But this one is from Gil Guerra, and he asks, how do you see emerging technologies such as 5G and artificial intelligence impacting American leadership on the world stage?
Oh, I love that question. So the United States has such a dynamic and creative economy. So all of you should at some point raise a glass, if you're drinking age, raise a glass to Chapter 11 bankruptcy in these United States. Because as much as anything else, that's what gives us the go-go inventiveness of the American economy. That if you run your business bankrupt and you have another good idea, you can get funding for the other good idea instead of losing your house as collateral or anything else. And the combination of great research universities, immigration that permits creative, hardworking people to come to this country to study and to stay. All of those factors create an ecosystem that's actually very difficult to replicate. So, for example, if you think about China, which has 1 billion people, which is a really big base of talent, and it has great science education, and but until an Argentinian coder who wants to leave Argentina wants to move and spend her life in Beijing, the United States is likely to continue to have really significant advantages because that woman can move to Palo Alto or to St. Louis. She'll be an American in 10 years, and her children can grow up and run the country. And the magnetism of that is actually very difficult to replicate. So I am somewhat less worried than many other defense experts about the relentless pace of technology. A second reason I'm less worried is because being a country full of immigrants, we have a higher risk tolerance than other countries, right? People who leave their own country for the hope of better opportunity elsewhere are by definition risk tolerant. And that's where you get Chapter 11 bankruptcy. That's where you get the lack of shame. I mean, I know venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who will not loan money to somebody who hasn't run a business bankrupt. Because what it tells them is this person's not thinking big enough. So I think we have a bunch of advantages that are likely to continue to sustain. If I may give one homework assignment to people on the call, which is if you have not read James Fallow's article from 2009 in The Atlantic, what's it called? Something American Foreign Policy. It is the single best thing ever written about American foreign policy, because he argues that the United States only gets its act together when we're afraid we're failing. And so that's the hope to take from this particular time. Technologically, we're afraid the Chinese are surpassing us, right? Just as we feared the Japanese were in the 1980s and the Germans were in the 1950s. This is how we get ourselves organized and make the choices that restore the well springs of our strength. And I think in some ways, the pandemic and the protests for justice are likely contributories to that too. We are being reminded who we are and being reminded who we want to be. I can't hear you, Emma, you're muted.
Oops, okay, there we go. Well, I think that that's all the time we have for questions, unfortunately. Thank you all so much for submitting those questions. They were excellent.
Thank you for listening, my friends.
Well, Dr. Schake, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Really appreciate you taking the time. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. We hope that you can join us again next Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be speaking with AEI's Diana Schaub on the enduring legacies of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. So please keep an eye out for that invitation tomorrow. And please do check out our full June lineup on Facebook and Instagram at AEI for Students. And lastly, if you have undergraduate friends who are interested in these types of conversations, invite them to sign up for our student network to receive invitations to the Summer Speaker Series, and also just learn more about the different opportunities that AEI has for students. So thank you all again for joining, and we hope to see you all again next week. And thank you again, Dr. Schake.